What is up, Internet? AJ here, and welcome back to the channel. We got an awesome video this week planned for you guys because the inspiration for it comes from one of my viewers directly. You see, this week in the Discord, link down in the description below, one of my followers actually posed an interesting question, and the question was, is it more difficult to transition from playing melee characters to spellcasters or vice versa? And my immediate response was, well, transitioning from melee to spellcasters, but why? And when I thought about it, I realized it's the implementation of spellcasting. It adds a whole new degree of things to the game itself, and it's one more thing to keep track of. So I decided this week, let's see if we can help clear things up a little bit. And today's video is going to be everything you need to know about spellcasting in D&D 5e. Now, before we get started here, folks, if you like what we're doing, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Go ahead and hit that bell icon for notifications of when we post new videos, and go ahead and leave a comment if you got something to say about what we post here, or maybe even a question related to D&D. Go ahead and throw it down below, and let's see if we can get that answered for you. Now, onto the video proper. The way I want to do this is basically go down the whole list of things about spellcasting, kind of break it down for you bit by bit. We got a lot to get into, so let's go ahead and keep this moving. The first thing I want to cover are known and prepared spells. Now, spells known is pretty self-explanatory. This is the number of spells that your character knows. Now, this can vary from class to class. Either your character is going to know all the spells from their class, or they're only going to know a select few. This will be indicated in your player's handbook under the table for your character class, and if they don't know all of the spells for their class, it's going to have a whole little column indicating how many spells they know at what level. Spells prepared, on the other hand, apply specifically to the classes that know all of their spells for their class right off the bat. This, however, is going to give them the option to change the spells that they have available from day to day. It limits the spells that they can use at any given time, much like the spells known does for the other classes. However, they have a little more flexibility in what spells they have prepared on a daily basis. The next thing we're going to cover are spell slots. These are the resources you use to actually cast your spells, and they're going to level from 1 through 9. These do recover on a long rest, so you can regain them back then, with the exception of certain classes being able to regain them on a short rest. But these coincide with the level of the spells that you're going to be casting. Every spell has its own level and requires a spell slot of at least that level to be cast. You can't use a lower spell slot to cast a higher level spell. However, you can use a higher level spell slot to cast a spell of a lower level with additional effects required. That'll typically be listed in your player's handbook under the description of the spell, and you can see what additional effects you'll get out of it then. This, however, does not apply to cantrips. And that's going to bring us to our next topic. Cantrips. Cantrips are actually 0-level spells. Their usefulness is going to be varying in degree. It's not going to be as powerful as anything from a first level on, but they are going to have different uses. Typically, they'll be cast at action speed, with 1 or 2 exceptions to that rule. The amount of cantrips that your character has available to it will always be listed in the class table, as none of the classes know all of the cantrips. Now, the next thing I want to get into are the different parts of a spell. These are going to be listed under the description of the spell, and it's going to basically break down how the spell works, how long it takes to cast, how long it lasts for, all of those things, including the effects of the spell. You can find it all in the description of the spell itself, but we're going to break down what each of those things mean right here. First thing we're going to cover is the casting time of the spell. How long does it take you to cast it? Now, there's a couple different ranges here, a couple different ways that it can be cast, but this is basically, is it going to be an action, a bonus action, a reaction, something along those lines. Sometimes it takes even longer to cast than that. Bear in mind, a turn in D&D takes only 6 seconds. So it is comprised of an action, reaction, and bonus action. That being said, you can only cast 1 spell a turn, with certain exceptions. Stay tuned to the end of the video. We'll get into it there. Now, first thing we're going to talk about is action speed. Action speed is going to be your bread and butter of spellcasting. Most of the spells you have available to you are going to be cast at this speed. You'll be very familiar with it, and there's no funny business here. Next thing we're going to cover is the bonus action speed. So a lot of these spells are going to be buffing spells, something to do before you do something else rather than cast a spell. Now, the next one we're going to cover are reaction speed spells. These are my favorite. These are the spells that you cast in reaction to somebody doing something else. Tieflings are familiar with this in the form of Hellish Rebuke, My personal favorite is when your little murder hobos like to cast Fireball after discovering it at 5th level. The funny thing about that is at the same time, the spell Counterspell becomes available. They get a little heavy-handed with the Fireball, hit them with that Counterspell in response, and then remind them that crying is a free action. Now the next two things kind of go together as they're just longer casting times. Now, you've got ritual spells, which these spells will specifically have the ritual tag listed on them. What that means is this spell can be cast over a 10-minute period of time without using a spell slot in order to cast it. They're going to have varying degrees and effects, but they do require that 10-minute cast time. Now that being said, all of these spells can be cast at a normal action speed by using their spell slot associated with them, so don't feel like you have to wait 10 minutes just to cast a spell. There are options. And then the other thing is just longer cast times. Sometimes a spell takes a full minute to cast, sometimes it takes 10 minutes to cast without being a ritual, sometimes it can take hours. Those are a little fewer and farther between, but keep in mind that some of these spells take longer to cast, so trying to cast them in combat is just not going to work. You can find that in the description as far as how long it's going to cast, so just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. That brings us to our next point, which is going to be range. Range is how far your spell is going to have an effect. Now, there are various different things that can increase the range of your spell, but for the most part, your spell is going to have its range very specifically listed in the description. There's not much more to go into with that. It's pretty self-explanatory. So that'll take us into components. You've got 3 types of components. The first is going to be verbal. These are the things you say to cast the spell. Now, it's probably going to be a series of words, but it's pretty non-specific as far as what you actually say. So it could be a series of grunts or just weird sounds that you decide to make that cast your spell for you. Talk to your DM, see if they'd let you add a little flavor to it. The next one is going to be somatic gestures. These are body movements that you use to cast a spell. These are also pretty non-specific as far as what needs to be done, so your DM may give you a little creative freedom on that. Talk it over with them. That can be fun too. The last type of component we're going to talk about are material components. These are specific items that are typically required to cast a spell, and they can all be found in the player's handbook. Now, that being said, they don't actually deplete upon use unless specified in the spell itself, but a lot of DMs don't necessarily keep track of that or just assume that your character would have them anyways to cast a spell, oftentimes with the exception of items that get depleted upon use. I personally don't like to keep track of it just because if they have the spell, you would think that they would have it, with the exception of revival spells. Things like that that require usable resources that have certain effects that go with them, those I tend to be a little more specific on keeping track of material components for. Now the next thing we're going to get into then is going to be the duration of spells. This is how long your spell effect is going to last for. And the first one we're going to touch on is instantaneous. The vast majority of your spells are going to be instantaneous because the effect will take place right away. This is typical with your damage spells like Firebolt, Fireball, all of these things that hit and impact and do their damage immediately, and then there's no effect beyond that. Most of your damage spells, when they hit, won't persist beyond that, but I say most. Next up, you'll find spells that last a round, maybe a couple of rounds. That'll be specified in your player's handbook, but this is how long the effect persists for. Now, a lot of these are going to be spells that buff your character or do something minor for just one round. It'll add an additional effect to them, improve a skill or something that they can do, but at the end of the round, the effect is done. Beyond that, you have spells that last minutes or hours, and keep in mind that 1 minute is 10 rounds. So at a certain point, it just makes sense to keep track of it in minutes beyond what the rounds would be. But these are your spells that are going to have a longer persisting effect. And in combat, 1 minute can seem like an eternity. But other spells outside of combat you'll find tend to last for 10 minutes, an hour, whatever the case may be. And knowing what they do and how long they last for is all going to be in your handbook. So just kind of keep that in mind there. Now that being said, some of these longer lasting spells do require concentration. Concentration is required to cast the spell and keep the spell up, and you can only have one concentration spell up at a time. Now there's a couple ways the spell can come down. Either you cast a new concentration spell, and the first one deteriorates, or you can choose to drop the concentrated spell. Some people may do that in response to casting a new one or in preparation for something else. There's a lot of reasons you can drop a concentration spell. The next way is taking damage. When you take damage in D&D, if you're holding a concentration spell, you have to maintain focus on the spell, and in turn you'll have to do a concentration check. A concentration check is going to be a constitution saving throw with a DC of 10 or half the amount of damage that you took, whichever is going to be higher. So say you took 30 points of damage in one shot while holding a concentration spell. You would have to make a constitution save of a 15 or higher to maintain concentration on the spell. Conversely, if you took 6 points of damage, you would still have to make a concentration check of a 10 or higher. And then the last way that the spell can drop is if you're incapacitated or outright killed. If you're not conscious to keep concentration on the spell's going to drop. Now, as far as targeting goes, there's a couple things here to keep in mind. Number one, targeting yourself. You can do it. In fact, you always have the option unless the spell says otherwise. So if a spell says target any creature that you can see, you can include yourself on that unless it specifies that it has to be a hostile target or that you can't target yourself. The other thing to keep in mind about targeting is you have to keep a clear line of sight on the target you're casting a spell on. There can be cover penalties on ranged spell attacks, like there would any other normal ranged attack, but you have to be able to see them to target them. That being said, once you hit them with the spell, if it's a concentration spell, you do not need to keep line of sight on them. If you cast a spell on them that persists and they duck back behind a wall, you still maintain concentration on the spell once it's up. The next thing we're going to get into here is areas of effect. So it's time to brush up on your geometry knowledge, because here we go. The first thing we're going to cover is a cone. Now, this seems pretty self-explanatory, but there's a couple things to note here. Specifically that the range of the cone is also going to be the width at any given point of the cone. So, to make this a little simpler, as an example, say you have a 15-foot cone. That is what the spell lists for you. So what you do then is you can establish from the point of origin 15 feet. At the end of that 15 feet, the width of the cone itself will be 15 feet. It's always going to be as wide as it is far from the point of origin. Next up is going to be the cube. Now, cube has 6 sides. All of the sides are going to be the same size. And the way you measure the cube is going to be listed in the spell as the size of each side. It has it listed there pretty self-explanatory in the descriptions of each spell, but to kind of give you an example, say you have a 15-foot cube. The cube is going to be 15 feet on each side, on any given side. Now, cylinders. These ones get a little bit tricky because there's a couple different measurements to keep track of. You've got the radius and then you've got the height. Now, you're going to pick your point of origin with this spell. From that point of origin, which can either be the top or the bottom of the spell, the area is going to radiate out from that point. So basically that will be your radius size. If you pick a point and it's a 15-foot radius, it'll radiate 15 feet from that point in a circle around the point. From there, the spell radiates either upwards or downwards. You get to pick for the height of the spell. So say it's a 15-foot radius with a 40-foot height. You choose the point, it radiates 15 feet from there and then rises in a 40-foot column above that. Hopefully that simplifies it for you guys. From there, we're going to move on to something a little more simple. A line. I don't think I have to get too far into depth with this one, but to break it down nice and simple, if you look in the book, it's going to tell you how far the line goes and how wide the line is. The last thing we're going to cover are spheres. Now these ones are similar to columns, except you've only got one measurement you need to worry about, and that is the radius. Now with these, you'll pick the point of origin for the spell, and the spell is going to radiate in all directions the distance of the radius. That's it. Plain and simple. It's going to be a big ball forming in the point that you pick, and it'll radiate from the point that you decide on. Hopefully, that simplifies all of the different areas of effects for you guys. Now, with casting spells, especially ones that persist, are going to come saving throws. Saving throws are what are rolled to determine if your target succeeds or fails in resisting the spell that is cast upon them. Now, in order to know what they have to roll, you have to establish what your DC is going to be. Your spell save DC is typically going to be figured by taking 8 and adding your proficiency bonus and your spellcasting modifier, plus any other additional magical bonuses you get from gear or whatever else your DM gives you. Now, keep in mind Your spellcasting modifier is actually going to be the ability score that you use to cast spells. This does vary from class to class, so keep an eye on that in the player's handbook. It'll be under your class description as far as what you use to cast spells and make it a little easier for you guys to keep track of. Now, as far as offensive spells, some of them are actually going to require you to make an attack roll, much like you would a ranged attack. Now with these, instead of using your strength or your dexterity modifiers, you're actually going to use your proficiency bonus and your spellcasting modifier, just like with the spell save DC. Now with these, keep in mind they are ranged attacks, so if you're within 5 feet, it's still going to impose disadvantage on your attack. Try to stay at a range. Now with all of this, there's a lot of magical effects that are going to be on the board at any given time, and a lot of them do stack, but something to keep in mind is that you cannot combine the effects of the same spell, even if it's cast by multiple people. If you're casting the same spell as somebody else and it has a persistent effect, only one of those is going to be active at a given time. That being said, magical effects that are similar from different spells can still stack. So go ahead and throw that on there. Hex with maybe a hunter's mark, those things work in conjunction together. But casting 2 hexes, same spell. Sorry, can't do it. Now the last thing I want to cover here is kind of something I touched on earlier in the video, and it's the fact that you can't cast more than 1 spell a turn. That's not 100% accurate. There is one situation in which you can cast more than 1 spells on a given turn, and that is if one of those spells is a 0 level spell, a cantrip. Now most cantrips, as I mentioned, are going to have an action cast speed, so that would leave your bonus action free to be cast by a non-cantrip spell. This is the only situation in the game in which you can cast 2 spells in the same turn, and this does still apply to sorcerers even with their meta magic. It just means that they can cast action level spells as a bonus action. They still have to follow the rule of 1 regular leveled spell and 1 cantrip per turn. Those are the exceptions. Now there are some people who may have a house rule that differs from that, but as far as the rules is written, that's kind of the way it goes. So what do you guys think? Did I cover everything pretty well for you guys? Do you have any questions that I might have missed, or maybe even a question on a different D&D related topic? Go ahead and leave that in the comment section down below and let me know what you guys think. If you think this will help somebody out, go ahead and like and share the video with your friends. See what they think about it, and maybe we can help out some of them fledgling spellcasters out there. If you do like what we're doing, make sure to hit that subscribe button, and don't forget to hit the bell icon for notifications. And while you're at it, feel free to check out some of my other videos there, see if we can help you in some other topics. Plus, if you guys want to add in your own input, I'm going to go ahead and leave a link to the Discord channel down below. We do have a D&D channel there which you guys can check out and maybe add your own commentary or ask questions and see if we can help you out there. Don't forget guys, we do play D&D every week over on the Twitch channel there at www.twitch.tv/AJRPG. We play Halcyon Tales every Wednesday starting at 6:30 Central Standard Time, so you can check us out there while I kind of dip into the world of online DMing a little bit more, and we have players of all experience levels, so it's a good opportunity to see how players of all different levels play the game and maybe get some ideas for yourself. In the meantime, that's going to be it from me folks. I hope you guys have a great week, and I will catch you guys in the next video. Happy gaming.